As we said last week, there seems to be a lot of confusion over what Ellen White taught about the duration of Jesus' existence. Did she teach that he had a beginning at some point in eternity past, or did she teach that he always existed with the Father as a co-eternal member of the Godhead? Even though our studies are usually related to the Sabbath School Quarterly, we decided to go off topic from the Quarterly last week and this week in order to address this issue.
In our study last week, we examined Ellen White's statement that Jesus is self-existent and that there never was a time when he was not in close fellowship with the Father. What we found is that when read in their own historical context, these expressions simply don't express the idea that Jesus was co-eternal with the Father. Neither statement addresses the duration of Jesus' existence one way or the other. We showed evidence from Ellen White's lifetime that the expression, "there never was a time when he was not fill in the blank," was used with reference to a lot of people, and it didn't indicate having no beginning. Instead, people used, and still use, this phraseology to express that someone does something without deviation. And as for her statement that Jesus is self-existent, we showed that the concept of self-existence in early Seventh-day Adventism wasn't beginninglessness, but rather independent self-perpetuation. And other early SDAs beside Ellen White referred to Jesus as self-existent even while maintaining he had a beginning. The bottom line is that we just can't know from these statements of Ellen White's what position she held regarding whether Jesus had a beginning or not. If you haven't listened to last week's study yet, we hope you will. The evidence is quite compelling. You can find the link in the description. Now, this leads us to the aspect we'll focus on in today's study. Is there anything Ellen White said that does let us know what she taught on this issue?
The answer is yes. But before we get to her statements, first we'll read some of what her fellow SDA pioneers said on this topic, since that'll provide important historical and doctrinal context. I think it's pretty well known that her fellow pioneers held that Jesus did indeed have a beginning at some point, at the point he was begotten of the Father. Let's read some of these statements. In an article in the Review and Herald from 1854, we read, quote, "The idea of Father and Son supposes priority of the existence of the one and the subsequent existence of the other. To say that the Son is as old as his Father is a palpable contradiction of terms. It's a natural impossibility for the Father to be as young as the Son, or the Son to be as old as the Father. If it be said that this term is only used in an accommodated sense, it still remains to be accounted for why the Father should use as the uniform title of the highest and most endearing relation between himself and our Lord, a term which in its uniform signification would contradict the very idea he wished to convey. If the inspired writers had wished to convey the idea of the coetaneous existence and eternity of the Father and Son, they could not possibly have used more incompatible terms." Close quote. That's J.M. Stevenson. That's from the Review and Herald, November 14th, 1854.
So clearly here, this article in the Review and Herald, edited at this time by Ellen's husband James White, is making the argument that if God wanted to convey the idea that the Father and Son had a coetaneous existence, he could not have inspired the writer to use more incompatible terms. Stevenson is basically saying that because God himself has chosen the words Father and Son to communicate truth about Jesus and himself to humanity, and that since the point of communication is to express things in an understandable way to the other party, we can know that God intended for us to understand that he is older than his Son. To suggest otherwise would be to say that God expects us to believe an idea that's contrary to the idea expressed in the terms he has chosen as a means of revealing the Godhead.
Okay, now let's read something on this from Uriah Smith. He wrote, quote, "The scriptures nowhere speak of Christ as a created being, but on the contrary, plainly state that he was begotten of the Father. See remarks of Revelation 3:14, where it is shown that Christ is not a created being. But while as the Son, he does not possess a coeternity of past existence with the Father, the beginning of his existence as the begotten of the Father antedates the entire work of creation, in relation to which he stands as joint creator with God. John 1:3, Hebrews 1:2. Close quote. That's again Uriah Smith from Thoughts on the Book of Daniel and the Revelation, page 430. That's from 1882. So here, Smith says that Jesus was not a created being, but a begotten Son of the Father. He then states that Jesus' existence antedates the work of creation and that Jesus stands as joint creator with God. Yet it is clear that he says Jesus' existence had a beginning and that he isn't co-eternal with God.
And J.N. Andrews wrote, quote, "And as to the Son of God, he would be excluded also as a candidate for the person of Melchizedek. For he had God for his Father, and did at some point in the eternity of the past have beginning of days." End quote. And that's J.N. Andrews from the Review and Herald, September 7th, 1869. Of course, Andrews is referring to the fact that Hebrews 7:3 says that Melchizedek is without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. Andrews reasoned that Jesus could not be a candidate for the person of Melchizedek because he had a father, and therefore did, at some point in the eternity of the past, have beginning of days. As a side note, the author of Hebrews also connects the idea of having a father with having a beginning of days.
Okay, now let's read some selections from the writings of E.J. Wagner, who was one of the Justification by Faith messengers, along with Ellen White, in and around the year 1888. In 1889, he wrote, quote, "In arguing the perfect equality of the Father and the Son, and the fact that Christ is in very nature God, we do not design to be understood as teaching that the Father was not before the Son. It should not be necessary to guard this point, lest some should think that the Son existed as soon as the Father. Yet some go to that extreme, which adds nothing to the dignity of Christ, but rather detracts from the honor due him, since many throw the whole thing away rather than accept a theory so obviously out of harmony with the language of Scripture, that Jesus is the only begotten Son of God. He was begotten, not created. He is of the substance of the Father, so that in his very nature he is God, and since this is so, it pleased the Father that in him should all fullness dwell." Colossians 1:19. While both are of the same nature, the Father is first in point of time. He is also greater in that he had no beginning, while Christ's personality had a beginning. Again, that's E.J. Wagner, Signs of the Times, April 8th, 1889.
Clearly, Wagner is saying that Jesus is equal with the Father and that he was not created. Yet he very plainly spells out that Jesus was not co-eternal with God. Instead, he was begotten. Wagner's view of Jesus as the begotten Son of God is more fully expressed in his book Christ and His Righteousness, also published in 1889. Let's read some excerpts from that book. Quote, "We know that Christ proceeded forth and came from God." That's John 8:42. "But it was so far back in the ages of eternity as to be far beyond the grasp of the mind of man." Close quote. That's from page 9. Quote, "Christ is the Son of God by birth." Close quote, page 13. Quote, "Christ is a begotten Son and not a created subject. He has by inheritance a more excellent name than the angels. He is of the very substance and nature of God and possesses by birth all the attributes of God." Close quote, page 22. Quote, "The angels are sons of God, as was Adam, by creation. Christians are the sons of God by adoption, Romans 8:14 and 15. But Christ is the Son of God by birth. And so Christ is the express image of his Father's person." Close quote. Again, these excerpts are from E.J. Wagner's book, Christ and His Righteousness. This last one from page 12.
Clearly, Wagner understood Jesus to be God's Son, begotten or birthed, before the foundation of the world. Due to being God's Son, he shared God's nature. Notice that Wagner drew clear lines of distinction between the idea that Jesus is co-eternal with God and the idea that Jesus is God's Son, begotten in the days of eternity. He also distinguishes between a Son of God by creation, adoption, and birth, or begetting. As we've already seen, this view wasn't just Wagner's, it was the consensus view among early SDAs. The quotes we shared are only a sample, so our question now is this: did Ellen White share this view? As we're about to see, the answer is quite clearly yes. Let's start with a statement she wrote in 1895. And notice how she expresses her view in Jesus as God's begotten Son in language almost identical to what we just quoted from Wagner.
In an article in Signs of the Times, May 30th, 1895, she wrote, quote, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, not a son by creation, as were the angels, nor a son by adoption, as is the forgiven sinner, but a son begotten in the express image of the Father's person. Close quote. Here, Ellen quite obviously speaks with the same voice as the other pioneers. This statement would be perfectly at home, coming from any of their pens, and we all know what any of the other pioneers would mean by saying it. The fact of the matter is that Ellen White led a movement that unitedly and openly taught that Jesus had a beginning through being begotten by God. And she never spoke against this view. She even made statements nearly identical to theirs on this same subject. To think that despite these facts, she actually agreed with the now-prevailing view instead of the then-prevailing view is simply implausible.
So now let's back up and zoom in on the part of Ellen's statement we just read that says Jesus is a son begotten in the express image of the Father's person. In fact, let's read that statement again. It says, quote, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, not a son by creation, as were the angels, nor a son by adoption, as is the forgiven sinner, but a son begotten in the express image of the Father's person. Again, that's from Signs of the Times, May 30th, 1895, paragraph 3.
First, the word begotten here is clearly referring to an act of God that is opposite to, or distinct from, the acts of creating or adopting. These are all different ways to become sons of God. While becoming a son by adoption implies the existence of the prospective son prior to the establishment of the father-son relationship, this isn't true for becoming a son by creation or begetting. A son by creation is a son from the moment he is made. The same is true for a begotten son, and this was evidently Ellen White's idea of Jesus as God's begotten Son. This can be seen in another statement she made that contains a phrase that is almost word for word the same as her statement that Jesus is a son begotten in the express image of the Father's person. Here's what she said, quote, the eternal Father, the unchangeable one, gave his only begotten Son, tore from his bosom him who was made in the express image of his person, and sent him down to earth to reveal how greatly he loved mankind. Close quote, Ellen White, and that's from Review and Herald, July 9th, 1895, paragraph 13.
So in this second statement, Ellen says that Jesus, the only begotten Son, was made in the express image of his Father's person before he was torn from his Father's bosom to be given to us. So, in the first statement, she said Jesus was begotten in the express image of his Father's person. And here she says that Jesus was made in the express image of his Father's person. Since she's using begotten and made interchangeably between these two statements, it should be easy to see that she understood begetting as the means by which Jesus was made. This makes him unlike the angels who were made by means of creation. It also makes him unlike adopted sons, since Jesus was God's Son from the very moment he was made.
I should also mention that this parallel between made and begotten isn't only found in comparing these two statements. It is also apparent in this last statement on its own. Consider, she says that God gave his only begotten Son, tore from his bosom him who was made in the express image of his person. The second clause is restating the idea of the first clause. In other words, saying that God tore Jesus from his bosom is a more fully expressed way of saying that God gave Jesus. Likewise, referring to Jesus as him who was made in the express image of his Father's person is a more fully expressed way of referring to Jesus as God's only begotten Son.
These last two statements show us that Ellen White understood that Jesus was made, and that the means by which he was made is God's act of begetting him. This is plain confirmation that she has the same view as the other pioneers on this point, specifically that Jesus had a beginning, but that he's not a created being. He shares God's own nature since he's God's own Son, begotten in the express image of his Father's person. Now let's read another statement from Ellen that expresses this same sentiment, that Jesus was made in the express image of his Father. In a letter from 1905, she wrote, quote, Christ was the Lord of heaven and earth. Yet for our sake he became poor, that we through his poverty might be made rich. He was made in the likeness of God. Yet he humbled himself and took upon him the form of a servant, that he might save us. That's from Letter 133, 1905, paragraph 6.
So here, like in the previous statement, Jesus was made in the likeness of God before he humbled himself to become like one of us. If we don't understand made here to be referring to Jesus' origins, this would make the statement imply that Jesus initially existed as a being who was unlike God and who was only later made to be like God. It is unlikely that any Adventist would want to interpret Ellen White as meaning that, and even more importantly, this simply couldn't have been Ellen White's meaning given other things she said. This leaves no other option but that she's saying Jesus was made, and when he was made, his form was in the likeness of God, which is precisely the same idea we just read from her other statements.
So from all of this, it should be clear that Ellen White didn't share the popular view that Jesus and the Father are co-eternal. But now let's look at this from a slightly different angle. The common idea is that in order for Jesus to be equal with God, he has to be co-eternal with God. We already quoted E.J. Wagner directly countering this view. Again, he said, quote, "In arguing the perfect equality of the Father and the Son, and the fact that Christ is in the very nature God, we do not design to be understood as teaching that the Father was not before the Son. While both are of the same nature, the Father is first in point of time. He is also greater in that he had no beginning, while Christ's personality had a beginning." Again, that's from E.J. Wagner, Signs of the Times, April 8, 1889.
Again, according to the common view, the co-equality and co-eternality of the Father and Son go together. They're advocated as natural corollaries of the idea that while the Father and Son are two persons, they are one being. But Ellen White simply didn't share this view. She regarded the Father and Son as two distinct beings. And while she regarded them as equal, she didn't think they were co-eternally equal. Rather, she taught that Jesus was at some point made equal with God. In Patriarchs and Prophets, page 37, paragraph 1, she wrote, quote, "The exaltation of the Son of God as equal with the Father was represented as an injustice to Lucifer, who, it was claimed, was also entitled to reverence and honor." Close quote.
So here we see that there was a point at which Jesus received the exaltation as equal with the Father, and that Satan thought he was also entitled to receive such exaltation. Basically, it wasn't always the case that Jesus was in this exalted position as equal with the Father. In Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1, she gives a fuller context concerning this. She wrote, quote, "The great Creator assembled the heavenly host, that he might, in the presence of all the angels, confer special honor upon his Son. The Son was seated on the throne with the Father, and the heavenly throng of holy angels was gathered around them. The Father then made known that it was ordained by himself that Christ, his Son, should be equal with himself, so that wherever was the presence of his Son, it was as his own presence. The word of the Son was to be obeyed as readily as the word of the Father. His Son he had invested with authority to command the heavenly host. Especially was his Son to work in union with himself in the anticipated creation of the earth and every living thing that should exist upon the earth. His Son would carry out his will and his purposes, but would do nothing of himself alone. The Father's will would be fulfilled in him." There was contention among the angels. Satan and his sympathizers were striving to reform the government of God. They were discontented and unhappy because they could not look into his unsearchable wisdom and ascertain his purposes in exalting his Son Jesus and endowing him with such unlimited power and command. They rebelled against the authority of the Son. Close quote. That's from Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1, pages 17.2 and 18.2.
So again, clearly, Ellen held the view that Jesus was made equal to the Father at some point in time. This equality had a start date. She says God conferred special honor on Jesus, that God ordained that Christ should be equal with himself, that God exalted his Son to this position, that God invested and endowed Jesus with this unlimited power, authority, and command. All these words imply a transition or elevation from one state to another. They're implying a change in status or position. In other words, they let us know that Jesus was not always equal to the Father, but was granted equality at a specific point in time through a deliberate act of God. And Satan was not happy with this change. The main point here is that this is straightforward evidence that Ellen White didn't hold the common view that Jesus relates to the Father as a person of co-eternal, co-equal status.
And we'll end today with this quote from Ellen. In Testimonies, Volume 8, page 268, she wrote, quote, "The scriptures clearly indicate the relation between God and Christ, and they bring to view as clearly the personality and individuality of each," close quote. She then quotes Hebrews 1, 1 through 5, which speaks of Jesus as God's Son, by whom he made the worlds, which is one example of many showing that Jesus was God's Son even before becoming human. Hebrews 1 also says that Jesus is the express image of God's person and that he's better than the angels and that he received a more excellent name from God and he received it by inheritance. It then refers to Christ as being begotten by God and expresses their father-son relationship. Ellen then says, quote, "God is the Father of Christ, and Christ is the Son of God. To Christ has been given an exalted position. He has been made equal with the Father. All the counsels of God are open unto his Son," close quote. Again, that's from Testimonies to the Church, Volume 8. This is from page 268.
Plainly, Ellen White is saying the true relation between Christ and God is that of Father and Son. And she's saying this is in the context of a passage that says Jesus is God's Son, begotten in his express image, in contrast to the angels. She brings this statement to the same doctrinal context as the other statements we've read. And then, in tandem with this, she says that Christ was given an exalted position and made equal with the Father.
Okay, recap time. We started by looking at statements from a few early SDA pioneers as examples of the early SDA belief that Jesus had a beginning at some point in time. They denied that Jesus was created, but argued instead that he was begotten by God before the work of creation. We then looked at statements from Ellen White that showed that she held the same view. Her statements indicated that Jesus was made, but not through being created, but rather by being begotten by God as his own Son. Next, we looked at statements from Ellen White wherein she says that Jesus' equality with God is something that was given to him by God, a position to which he was exalted. This is important because these statements are inconsistent with the popular view which suggests that Jesus' identity is one of intrinsic, co-eternal, co-equal status with God. Lastly, we considered a statement from Ellen White in which she straightforwardly explains the relationship between the Father and Son as being just that, a father-son relationship. In this last statement, she tied together several notions, including that Jesus was made equal with God, and also that he is, in his very identity, God's Son, begotten in the express image of his person.
That last statement we quoted is from a part of Testimonies for the Church, Volume 8, called A Personal God. In part, it discusses the relationship between the Father and the Son in the context of an early SDA pillar doctrine called the personality of God. We've actually made a whole series of videos that explains this doctrine. You can find a link to it in the description. We hope you'll watch it, since it'll help to understand the bigger picture that surrounds the ideas we've been discussing over the past couple of studies.
Thank you for staying with us till the end. We invite you to visit our website, www.bdsda.com, to learn more about who we are, and just as important, who we're not. Please join us each week as we'll continue to offer new and interesting insights for your Sabbath School studies.
And if you want to keep up with our new studies as they are published, we recommend subscribing. We are on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on plenty of other podcast apps. Links for subscribing are in the description. God bless.
Many blessings.